In this video, we will explain grounded theory, and it normally it comes as a part of the research methodology paper, and it's a qualitative form of doing research. So let us see what is meant by this grounded theory and what are the tools which we use in grounded theory, and what are the outcomes or the products of this research being done with the help of this grounded theory approach. And grounded theory has become the most widely used framework for analyzing qualitative data. Glaser and Strauss are the two originators of the grounded theory approach. And they published a book titled The Discovery of Grounded Theory, Strategies for Qualitative Research. And this book was published in 1967. And it is one of the most widely cited books in social science research. And in this book, these two writers detailed out the main elements of this grounded theory. What is grounded theory? Grounded theory has been defined as theory that is derived from data, systematically gathered and analyzed through the research process. So in short, this is a theory derived from data, and that data are systematically gathered and analyzed through a research process. In this method, data collection, analysis, and eventual theory stand in close relationship to one another. However, there is a lack of agreement on what grounded theory is. So we have a lack of agreement because economists, especially social science researchers, differ in respect of the meaning of this grounded theory. They define it in different ways. There is no unanimous or consensus regarding the definition of grounded theory. There is no agreement regarding the meaning of grounded theory. To some writers, it's a distinct method or approach to qualitative research in its own right. So some people believe that it's a very distinct approach, distinct method. But to some others, it's an approach to the generation of theory. So for some economists, for some social scientists, it's a very different approach in qualitative research. But for some others, it is an approach to generate a new theory out of data. That is, grounded theory is not a theory. So some people believe that grounded theory is not a theory. It is just an approach to the generation of theory out of data. So they believe that it is false to say that grounded theory is a theory. It is not right to say that grounded theory is a theory, whereas grounded theory can be considered as an approach only, an approach which is used to generate a theory out of data. Sometimes the term grounded theory is employed simply to imply that the analyst has grounded his or her theory in data. So that grounded theory is more or less synonymous with an inductive approach. So some people make a similarity between this inductive approach and grounded theory. We know what is meant by inductive approach. Inductive approach is a quantitative research method where we go from particular things to general, or from the analysis of data, we go to a generalization, or using the analysis based on data at the grassroots level or at the very bottom level, we arrive at a theory or we generalize something. That is what is done usually in inductive approach in quantitative method. So some people interchangeably use this inductive approach and grounded theory, believing that the grounded theory is not different from inductive approach. But in reality, grounded theory is more than this, more than inductive approach. And grounded theory refers to a set of procedures in research. What are the central features of grounded theory? It is concerned with the development of theory out of data. So we are making a theory out of data. And this approach is iterative or recursive, meaning that data collection and analysis proceed in tandem, repeatedly, referring back to each other. That means we will go from data to theory, and sometimes if we are not satisfied with the theoretical outcome, we may go back into the data again. So it is an iterative process, moving back and forth from one thing to another thing until we get a final product out of it. So this approach, this grounded theory approach, is an iterative process for some economists. So the grounded theory has got two central features. One is that it is concerned with the development of theory out of data. And the second, it is an iterative approach where we move back and forth from data to theory until we get a final product, that is theory, out of it. What are the tools of grounded theory? Here we will explain 4 important tools of grounded theory. The first one is theoretical sampling. We know the probability sampling, or the sampling which we generally use in our data collection method. But in contrast to the probability sampling, or the different type of sampling which we use in data collection, here we rely on theoretical sampling. So what is meant by theoretical sampling? Glaser and Strauss define the theoretical sampling in a different way. They say that theoretical sampling is a process of data collection for generating theory, whereby the analyst jointly collects, codes, and analyzes his data and decides what data to collect next and where to find them in order to develop his theory as it emerges. What does it mean? That means data collection is an ongoing process, not a single stage process as we do in the case of the quantitative data analysis. Because in quantitative research, we prepare a questionnaire or an interview schedule, collect the data at a particular single stage. Then after, we put the data for analysis. But here, such kind of a practice is not the general procedure here, because here we collect the data while coding the data, and at the same time we analyze the data, and finally we decide what data to collect next. If we need to collect data again and again, we will again go to the field and collect the data. So ultimately means we will continue the process of collecting the data, analyzing it, coding it, until a theory emerges out of that. So that's why it is called a theoretical sampling, not a structured sampling, or not a sampling like the probability sampling as we do in the case of the quantitative analysis or quantitative research. Rather than that, here we use a theoretical sampling. This is the first tool of the grounded theory, that's a theoretical sampling. Next is coding. This is a key process in grounded theory whereby data are broken down into component parts which are given names. So we will give some names, codes. It begins soon after the collection of initial data. Unlike quantitative research that requires data to fit into preconceived standardized codes, because in quantitative research, the codes are preconceived. The codes are determined even before we begin data collection. But here, that does not happen. Here, the researcher's interpretations of data shape his or her emergent codes in grounded theory. So you can have the flexibility in changing the code while research or while data collection is on. You can rely on emergent codes. You can reshape the codes. So it is not necessary that you must prepare the code in advance, as we do in the case of the quantitative research. So coding can be done as we proceed in data collection and analysis. So that is the one important difference between this method, grounded theory approach, and the other theory and the other qualitative approaches. So therefore, coding is an important tool in the grounded theory. Now, the third important tool is theoretical saturation. What is theoretical saturation? Theoretical saturation is a criterion for deciding when to cease collecting new data. When a particular theoretical idea and to move on to the investigation of some ramifications of the emerging theory. That means here, in theoretical saturation means it's a point where we decide to cease data collection, to stop data collection. That means we are satisfied with whatever we have collected. That means we have reached a saturation point as far as the data collection is concerned. We are satisfied with we have already got. Therefore, we have decided to cease collecting new data. No need to collect further data. We are satisfied with we have already collected, and we are very confident that we can create a theory out of the data which we have already collected. So theoretical saturation is a criterion for deciding when to cease or stop collecting new data on a particular theoretical idea and to move on to the investigation of some ramifications of the emerging theory. The constant comparison, this is another important tool of the grounded theory. What is constant comparison? It refers to a process of maintaining a close connection between data and conceptualization. So here we proceed from data, and using the data we arrive at certain concepts. For example, in the case of the income consumption relationship, we will get data of income and consumption. And using the data of income and consumption, we can develop a new concepts like the marginal propensity to consume, the proportion of income that is used by people for consumption. That means constant comparison means we are maintaining a close connection between the data of different types, and based on that, we arrive at certain concepts. Now, what are the outcomes of grounded theory? The following are the product or the outcomes of grounded theory. The first one is concepts. So from this grounded theory, we will be able to identify certain concepts. And we know that concepts are referred to as the building blocks of a theory. For example, multiplier, marginal propensity to consume. These are the concepts which we generally use in economics. And these concepts have been developed out of certain theoretical interpretations based on data. So concepts could be developed or could be the products of the grounded theory. Second is category or categories. What is a category? A category is a concept that has been elaborated so that it is regarded as representing real world phenomena. For example, primary sector, that's a category, secondary sector, that's a category, tertiary sector, that's a category. So these type of categories could be developed using this grounded theory. So this is a second important outcome of the ground theory. Now, we illustrate or we describe the attributes or the aspects of category. That is what's called properties. We describe, we explain the attributes of aspects of a category. For example, what are the characteristics of primary sector, secondary sector, like that. Then as a third output or outcome of the grounded theory, we develop a hypothesis. Hypotheses are initial hunches or our statement or feelings about relationship between concepts. For example, income and saving. As income increases, saving also increases. This is a kind of relationship which we are explaining in between the saving and income. So that could be called a hypothesis. So development of a hypothesis, of course, is an important product or outcome of the grounded theory. Now, lastly, we develop a theory itself from grounded theory approach. What is a theory? A set of well-developed categories that are systematically related through statements of relationship to form a framework that explains some relevant social or other phenomena. For example, take the case of the consumption function theory. It explains the functional relationship between consumption and income. So that kind of a theoretical formulations or framework could be developed using this grounded theory. There are two types or levels of theories. One is substantive theory and formal theory. Substantive theory relates to the theory in certain empirical instance or substantive areas such as occupational specialization. So here we apply the theory or we actually relate the theory to a particular empirical instance. Suppose that we test the theory only in a particular locality nearby. So that is what is called a substantive theory. But if you take the results of this substantive theory at a higher level of abstraction, And if you apply the substantive theory in a wide range of situations, then the theory will become qualified for application in a number of spheres. Then that will become what is called a formal theory. So first we develop a substantive theory using this grounded theory. And after that, we will develop a formal theory. So what we usually see in economics and social sciences are formal theories. Now, it is illustration. It's an illustration of the process and outcomes in grounded theory. So in the first column, we explain the process and the outcomes. So I will detail out these things in the next slide. So the above figure, or the figure which we have just seen, shows the steps, outcomes, and iterative nature of grounded theory. And these steps and outcomes are: the first step, the researcher begins with a research question. That is what it is shown here. I will show that. So here you can see. Okay. So here you can see the research question. This is a first process step. Second, theoretical sampling, collection of data, coding. So you can see arrow mark, up and down arrow mark. That means there is iteration going on. Iteration means movement back and forth from one important thing to the other. And here we are showing the outcomes. Outcomes we have already explained. So 5 outcomes are there. So this is a process. Actually, this is a process, and these are the outcomes. Okay, we are explaining processes step by step, and we will also explain outcomes along with that. So the researcher begins with a research question. Then what he does is that he goes for a theoretical sampling. Then he collects the relevant data. Then he codes, or data are coded. So these are the first 4 steps. The researcher begins with a research question, then goes for a theoretical sampling, then relevant data are collected, data are coded. So there is a constant movement backward and forward between the first 4 steps. That's what's called iteration. And what's the outcome of these 4 steps? That is coding, that is generation of concepts. Outcome is generation of concepts. 5th step is constant comparison. And constant comparison has an outcome, that is categories are generated, generation of categories. Now the 6th step is categories, saturation of categories, or categories are saturated. Then exploring relationship between categories. It's the 7th step. After the 7th step, we will get an outcome, that is hypothesis. We develop new hypothesis. Then we will move on to the 8th step, that is again theoretical sampling, because we are not satisfied with or we have to test the hypothesis again. Then we go for theoretical sampling, then data collection, then saturation of hypothesis, and finally we will come to a test of hypothesis. After testing the hypothesis, we will make a theory, that is substantive theory, that's outcome. Then to have a general applicability of the substantive theory, we will test the theory in other situations. So collection and analysis of data in other settings. And final outcome is development of a formal theory. So these are the important steps in grounded theory. The first step is researcher begins with a research question. Then he goes for a theoretical sampling. Then relevant data are collected. Then data are coded. Then the first outcome comes out, that is concepts. That's the first outcome. Then constant comparison is done. Then we get the next outcome, that is generation of categories. After that, categories are saturated. We are exploring the relationship between categories. Then we will make a hypothesis. That is next outcome, third outcome. Then again, we go for theoretical sampling, data collection, saturation of categories. Then we test the hypothesis. Then we will come to the next 4th important outcome, that is the development of a substantive theory. After that, we will develop the final one, that is the development of a formal theory. So this is how the grounded theory is used for developing theories based on data. Thank you.